Begin, a quick practical note. We have the translation in Italian, French, Spanish, German, and English. This event is being web streamed. I'm Giorgia Zarelli, advisor for economic affairs at the Party of European Socialists, and today I have the great pleasure of moderating this event. Thank you all for being here to discuss a crucial topic such as the EU social leasing and how to make electric mobility accessible to all Europeans by boosting demand through a tool at the same time that supports the industry of tomorrow. It's my greatest pleasure to give the opening remarks and the floor to the president of the S&D group, Iratxe García. Presidenta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, dear friends. I want you to think of something. A worker worried about the current situation in the world. War and the cost of living. Fuel prices rising, bills rising, worries rising. And today, with oil around $100 a barrel, driven higher by illegal wars, people's routines are becoming a burden. They face a choice between mobility and dignity. This is where Europe must answer, because mobility is not a luxury. It is not a privilege. It is a right. And if the cost of moving means some people move forward while others stay behind, then we are not moving as Europe. We are dividing Europe. That is why we are here today. And that is why I want to warmly thank Mohammed Chahim. Dear Mohammed, your leadership on this issue is not only timely, it is necessary. You are pushing us to turn ideas into action and action into change. And that is exactly what Europe needs now. Friends, high oil prices are not just numbers on a screen. They are shaping lives. They are deciding who can go to work easily, who can visit family, and who can live with freedom. They are exposing a simple truth. Our dependence on fossil fuels is not only an environmental problem, it is a social problem. And we cannot accept that, because when the price of energy goes up, inequality goes up with it. So we must act, and we must act with ambition. That is where our proposal comes in. Social leasing is not just a policy. It is a promise that the green transition will not leave people behind. A promise that clean mobility will not be reserved for those who can afford a new electric car. And a promise that Europe will protect both the planet and its people. Because today, let us be honest, switching to an electric car still requires a high upfront cost, too high for too many families. And that is why we say change the model. Make it possible to access a clean, a European-made electric car through a simple and affordable monthly payment. No, someday. Now. Has to be now. This is how we turn climate ambition into social reality. And this is how we deliver that we call a triple win. We cut emissions, we strengthen our industry, and we fight transport poverty, all at the same time. But let me be clear, we don't want just any proposal. We welcome that the Commission has included social leasing in its work program. That is a step forward, but Europe cannot afford half measures. If we are serious, then this must be a truly European plan. A plan that pulls demand so we can bring down cost and bring up ambition. A plan that targets those who need it most, low and middle income families, people in rural areas, and workers who depend on their car every day. And a plan that sets clear conditions on the cars we support. Because these cars must not only be electric, they must be sustainable in how they are produced. They must respect workers' rights with fair wages and a strong social dialogue. They must protect people's data. And yes, they must be made in Europe, because every car we support should also support European jobs, European factories, and European innovation. Friends, the race is already on. Others are moving fast. Global competition is real. And if we don't act, we risk losing both our industry and our values. But we have a plan, an ambition to deploy 10 million electric cars through social leasing between 2027 and 2032, in line with our social climate fund. An ambition to match our climate goals with real opportunities for people. An ambition to show that Europe can lead not only technology, but in fairness. Because this is what defines us. Through our history, we have always believed that progress must go on hand with justice, that growth must serve people, that Europe must protect. And today, once again, we are called to prove it. That is the Europe we are building, a Europe where the green transition is not a burden, but an opportunity. A Europe where mobility unites, not only divides. A Europe that moves forward together. And together, we will make it happen. Thank you so much for your presence here, because I'm sure that your presence is another signal of a political compromise with our common values and with our common ideas to improve the current situation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for these opening remarks. We now move to a short presentation of the S&D Group key demands on social leasing by S&D Vice President Mohammed Chahim, which I want to thank for having launched this initiative and organized this event on such a fundamental topic. Mr. Chahim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Georgia, and I, of course, as Vice President, can get all the thanks and claim that it was my idea, but it was really something coming from the working group. People like Thomas, like Nicolas, like Danica, like Bruno Tobac, like Annalisa, and these are all really, really, really great people working at the S&D Group, and they are from different countries. I have to say, maybe it sounds a bit strange, but the moment I went into European politics, it's always good to find someone that you have in mind when you're working on policies. And for me, that was my mother. And my mother today is exactly her 1 year. She died 1 year ago exactly today. And I always had my mother in mind when I worked on quite complicated matters. Like I always asked myself the question, what does it do in her life? We can work on rebalancing the market and we can think about very complicated measures, but at the end of the day, it's about people's lives. And I remember that when I was a member of the city council, we had a lot of subsidies and financial schemes to help people get solar panels. But my mother was never eligible for those schemes because she didn't earn enough. And I always said that, these schemes will be successful when everyone can make use of them, because then they become not something for the elite as some populists say, but it becomes something for the people. And then there was a day that my mother got solar panels. She came to me and said, should I take them? Because these are the costs, and I really think, I'm doubting a little bit, but what do you think? I said, I think you should take them, you should take 6, and I think they are very beneficial for you. That moment for me was a very striking moment, because I was working quite for a long time on the energy transition, on climate policy, but the moment my mother, who has a very limited pension, could afford personally, on her own, these solar panels, for me, that was a key moment, because she has 7 children and we could have paid those solar panels for her easily, but she wanted to pay that on her own. She was a very proud person. That moment for me was a moment that I said, okay, now this becomes for everyone. And very fast after that, I heard people in the community that I grew up in fighting each other about how much his solar panels was producing in kilowatt hours compared to the neighbor. For me, that was, again, a striking moment, because then these complicated, let's say, hard to reach green technologies become for the people. And now I think we should do the same for the electric car. The electric car has been subsidized for years for those, let's say, richer people that could afford a Tesla or a BYD or a BMW or a Mercedes through complicated leasing schemes, and they had benefited from lower taxations and lower fuel prices, or at least transport costs. I think now we should do it for everyone, and with that we will make another elite technology accessible for the many and not only for the few. And that's actually the drive and the motivation of many of us. Of course, our industry will benefit, and I think it's very important that our industry will benefit. We have people from the unions here today and people from industry today. Of course, that's good. Of course, we will save energy, especially during this energy crisis. That's important to save every liter of energy we can do. And I think with 1 million cars, we can save up to 750 million liters of fuel a year. So these are all beautiful benefits. But I just wanted to tell you about my deep motivation, why I think we need to make the electric car the car for all. It's a dominating technology, and the moment we make it the car for all, that's the moment people will perceive these climate measures, these energy measures, as something that's benefiting them, and not as, like our president has said, that there's a big barrier for them before they can access them. Because clearly, 20,000 euros, that's also a lot of money for many, many people. And through a leasing scheme, we can make it affordable and accessible for millions of Europeans. Just imagine that. People fighting each other about how much kilometers they drove with 1 kilowatt hour. That's some music to my ears. Because we will save money, we will save energy, and we will make a technology affordable for everyone with all the spillover effects to other sectors and to the industry. We have five demands. I think we need a European social leasing framework, coordinated and initiated through the European Commission, that other member states should implement as common as possible. Because collectivity is our strength. We've shown that in the past with the COVID vaccines. We know that collectively we are a strong negotiator. We can make good deals for every citizen in the EU. I think we need to have European guidance and common criteria. I think we need to make those that feel transport poverty at first, because social leasing should prioritize low and middle income families, rural residents, and shift workers, people who rely on their car at most, that do not have the privilege to work from home. And I think these social leasing contracts should be transparent. Again, we've written down all our criteria and we really think it is doable. I think we can take from the experiences in France and improve them for the rest of the EU. I think we have the funds to do it. I think we have the urgency to do it. One of the things we really focused on in the past is front-loading this ETS to make sure that before ETS 2 is implemented, that people are taking away or at least softened their burden when it comes to the high energy costs for home and for transport. And just imagine a social leasing scheme for cars, and next to that a social leasing scheme for heat pumps. Today we have really great panels from people all over Europe that are going to comment on it, how they think it can be implemented, what are the good things, what are the bad things. And I think, Georgia, I have to give you back the floor so we can start with these panels. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for this deep motivation and the key demands. So we now move to our first panel, Designing a European Social Leasing Scheme. I would like to invite to the podium Mr. Thomas Pellerin-Carlin and the speaker foreseen for this panel. Thank you very much. Good morning to all the speakers, and today indeed we have an excellent group of speakers. I would leave the honor to moderate this panel to S&D MEP Thomas Pellerin-Carlin, which is an active member in ITRE and in ENVI as well, and as we said, is a keen proponent of the social leasing. Mr. Pellerin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you today. I'm going to first deliver a 1-minute keynote, bigger word, a 1-minute address. I'll do that in French if you don't mind, so please feel free to take your headphones, but then don't worry, I'll be moderating everything in English. Tout d'abord, je voulais remercier.
First of all, my thanks to Iratxe, Mohammed, and a bit like Mohammed talking about his mother, I'm not going to talk about my mother. I'm going to talk about someone else called Angelica. She comes from my town, and like tens of thousands of people that are working hard, she needs a car to go to work. So she works in the care profession. She generally starts work very early. She drives maybe 20 kilometers to help somebody in their home, an elderly person, a handicapped person, and she does that. And she does a job that enables millions of people to live with dignity, even if they have a handicap, even if they have health problems or they are very elderly. After having helped the first patient, Angelica gets back in her car. There's no public transport that she can use to get to the point she needs to get to. And so she'll drive 30 kilometers to see another patient, another person she helps, and she'll do that throughout the whole day. At the end of her day, Angelica says to me she drives around 100 kilometers a day. There's a lot of care workers who actually do a lot more than that. She lives somewhere that's semi-urbanized, but other people live in the countryside and are likely to do 150, 160 kilometers a day. And that's in France, in Normandy, an area with quite a dense population. But if you go to the north of Sweden, for example, the number of kilometers done on a daily basis will be higher. So what does that mean in practice? We have people making a minimum wage. Angelica, if she works full-time, will be earning 1,500, 1,600 euros a month. But she'll be spending 300 euros a month on petrol. And that's if petrol is at 2 euros a litre, which it isn't anymore. So what happens? it means the decisions taken by Donald Trump, like the illegal war he started against Iran, means Angelica is now paying 380 euros a month for oil, for petrol. So that means that the illegal war that has been launched by a cruel man whose ignorance is no longer in doubt, is harming the most vulnerable people in our society. And that might sound strange for an MEP to be worried about a petrol bill that's 350 euros a month, which I get in per diems. But it's a considerable sum for so many people. So what can we do? The solution already exists. Electric vehicles are about 3 to 5 times cheaper to use than an ordinary conventional traditional car. I've done some sums which I can share with you. So you've got Angelica. She is paying 300 odd euros a month on petrol to go to work. But if we decide this, and if we have an electric vehicle given to Angelica through social leasing, well, the lease would be about 150 euros a month, and the electricity would cost 75 euros to do the mileage she has to do. So instead of spending 300 on petrol, which would go to the oil companies, instead of doing that, she could spend 150 euros plus 75 euros, 225, saving of 75 euros. And that money would go to workers from the companies that manufacture these cars in Europe and to pay for electricity produced in Europe. We produce 3% of the petrol that we use in Europe, but 100% of the electricity. So in France, we have asked the government to ensure that we have a French social leasing program so that 100,000 electric vehicles are made available to care workers to lease immediately as a part of the European decision. And it's unusual in European political life to do something that can immediately make lives better. But we can do that with this, which we as Social Democrats have been supporting for months now. And I'll be diplomatic about this, but the European Commission has been procrastinating on this subject. But I know we'll be going into a lot more details with a great many speakers who've honoured us by attending this morning, switching to English.
Each one of the speakers will have 5 minutes to give an introductory remark. And then after that, I will be leading a conversation between the 5-6 of us. And then we will open the floor. So in about 30 minutes, you guys in the room will have the capacity to ask questions and to provide comments. So without any further ado, we will start with Maria, who works for ASEA. ASEA did have a position on social leasing, so I would like to remind us what's your position and how you've seen the evolution or the lack of evolution of the Brussels bubble debate on this topic over the last few months.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Today, I'm going to speak on behalf of Europe's 17 largest manufacturers of cars, vans, trucks, and buses, European Automobile Manufacturers Association. But before I give you the perspective of the industry on the social leasing, I'd like us maybe to step back and look at the bigger picture. And many of the members of the European Parliament have rightly identified one of the challenges that Europe is facing in transitioning towards zero-emission mobility, the challenge of affordability of zero-emission vehicles. This challenge is also recognized by the industry. In fact, back in 2023, our 5-point manifesto for the new Commission identified affordable and accessible mobility for all citizens and businesses as a key priority for all transport and mobility-related policies. But affordability cannot be solved without underlying causes. Europe's competitiveness as a manufacturing location is under pressure, as we all very well know. Energy and raw material costs remain high. Inflation and higher costs of living also have an impact on the cost of vehicle manufacturing. On top of that, our industry is facing ever-expanding requirements when it comes to safety, emissions, materials, data and cybersecurity, and all these requirements, of course, make the vehicles safer, more sophisticated, more sustainable, but they also add up costs. Finally, of course, the shift from internal combustion engine to battery electric vehicles and the need to reinvent the value chains also requires lots of investments. So this is from the vehicle manufacturer's perspective. The cost is also clearly an issue from the consumer perspective, cost and convenience. So the infrastructure always feature as probably one of the top barriers that all European citizens have in switching towards zero-emission mobility. So if we want to make mobility more affordable for all European citizens, including vulnerable groups, I think this is the goal that everyone in the room shares, we also have to address all those key drivers, and otherwise we'll just be treating symptoms without treating the cause. So how does social leasing fit into all this picture? We believe that it has an important role to play as part of a broader package of incentives to stimulate demand for electric vehicles. If we look at the market data, we all know that the sales, the registrations of new battery electric vehicles are less than 20% in the EU, so we're still far from reaching the mass adoption that we need to see. So all the incentives that we can have, direct purchase incentives, fiscal incentives, social leasing, measures to improve the infrastructure, to accelerate the rollout of infrastructure, to reduce the electricity costs for charging, all of this needs to be taken into account for the electric mobility to continue to progress. So when it comes to maybe the social leasing, I'd like to emphasize 3 points. So the first one is indeed the social leasing can drive demand, but as part of a wider policy mix. Secondly, I think the scope of vehicles eligible for social leasing should be kept broad enough as well. Why not include also vans for that micro enterprises and small business owners need to? We all know that they are struggling a lot with the transition to electromobility. The registrations of new battery electric vans are less than 10%. So that segment needs urgent attention. And of course, the small business owners and micro enterprises often struggle financially. Why not include second-hand used battery electric vehicles in those schemes as well, because it will obviously further improve affordability of those vehicles and also help solve the problem of low residual value of used BEVs. So that could be a win-win solution as well. And then finally, we understand, of course, that it is tempting to think of a pan-European social leasing scheme, and some principles should be agreed at the European level, but what we also see is that all the member states have absolutely and sometimes completely different social, economic, geographical, demographic specificities, which of course mean that the people in those countries have different needs, and what would work for an urban environment with dense infrastructure may not work for a rural area. So we believe that the design of those schemes and eligibility criteria should probably be better designed by member states that obviously have a better view of the local conditions of their population. So I'll stop here, looking forward to the debate and also to hear other thoughts on this.
Many thanks, and thank you very much for being spot on the timing. So I hope the other speakers will follow your lead. Just a quick reaction, because you underlined the issue of subsidiarity in the end, if I can use that term, just to be clear. The way we approach that proposal as Social Democrats is to say that where the EU needs to act is especially in terms of pooling demand, a little bit like we did with the vaccines back in 2020, and that has one major benefit, is that it allows to reduce the budgetary cost. So if you don't pool demand, the unit cost of the subsidy would be most likely around 6,000–7,000 euros per car. While if you pool demand, you can reduce this, and especially if you pool demand and you already provide two things that the car industry needs: volume and also predictability. So you can already sign a contract today, say that we want X, for instance, I'm just making up the number here, but 1 million cars of this and that model being delivered in 2030 or 2031. And that's a way to have a genuine deal between the car industry on the one hand and policymakers. Obviously, the margin that the industry will make will be smaller in terms of the margin per car sold, but the volume will help make this also a good deal for the car industry and the car workers. So that's the way we envisage that issue of subsidiarity. As underlined also in my original comment, indeed, the situation in rural Sweden is quite different from the situation in urbanized parts of Belgium or northern Italy, for instance. But let's continue the conversation with Peter from ICCT.
Thank you. I come from the International Council on Clean Transportation. If you don't know us, we are a global non-profit research organization and think tank with about 30 people working from Europe on European topics. I will start by underlining the importance of social leasing. It is an important policy measure because there's about 20 million European citizens that are essentially caught in a trap. They are very car dependent. They live often in rural areas or semi-rural areas. They don't have alternatives because of their job, as Thomas explained in his example, or because there is simply no public transportation available or very little. And those people are hit the hardest if there's any spike in fuel prices as we see at the moment. So this is not just an abstract social risk. It is really a ticking affordability crisis that those people find themselves in. The second reason that I think Mohammed very nicely brought up is it's also a question of acceptability among the population, making sure that people feel part of the transition to electric vehicles or in general part of the future, and that this is not just something for the elites, which I think is a very important second reason to have such a social leasing scheme. Now, in terms of real-world examples, the French social leasing scheme is really the only large-scale project that has been conducted so far, and it was very successful. So within just a matter of weeks, there were more than 90,000 applications in the first round. There were the lowest income groups targeted, and those were also the people that applied. The average age of the people who made use of the social leasing in France was significantly lower than the typical people who buy electric vehicles. So it was, I would say, all in all, a great success. And it brought people in who otherwise would have been locked out of the transition. From that French experience, we can also learn how a social leasing scheme should be designed. And I will list 5 parameters. There's probably more than that, but those ones are, I think, the key ones. Number 1 is the income threshold, obviously, because you want to have a limit to the people who are eligible for the scheme. Otherwise, as we've seen in my home country, Germany, for example, in the subsidies before, it will mostly help those people who are already quite wealthy and can afford anyways. So income threshold is important. Secondly, some criteria about regional and commuting, a minimum distance that you have to commute or a certain region that you live in, because you want to target those who really don't have an alternative. Third criteria is the monthly payments. They have to be affordable. And from the French scheme, what we can see from the different literature that's available is that a range of about 100 to 200 euros, that is an amount on a monthly basis that unlocks real demand. So if it's as low as that, then people are interested in social leasing. If it's higher than that, it doesn't work for those people who you actually want to target. Then number 4, there should be a focus on small, maybe medium electric vehicles. Why? Because we see that in pretty much all the vehicle segments there is today a broad offer of electric vehicle models available, and those vehicles have become more affordable over the years. But there's one exception, and that is the small vehicle segment. There's still quite few electric vehicles on offer, and those tend to be relatively expensive. So the social leasing scheme should target exactly those vehicles, send a supply signal to the car industry. Thomas mentioned predictability and volume, so that's important for the car industry. And over time, it will also help to create a second-hand market for those small electric vehicles, which is very important as well and will benefit additional users and owners. And I'll add a fifth one, which can really leverage the benefits of the social leasing scheme, and that is a scrapping element. So if you add a component to the scheme and say those vehicles that are the oldest and the most polluting are taken off the road first, then you have really a leverage element where you can increase the climate and the environmental benefit without additional costs. So income thresholds, regional commuting criteria, affordability of the monthly payments, targeting small cars, and the scrapping element. The financing, I think, has not come up so far yet, but also, there are studies on that showing that the ETS2 revenue, for example, could be used. In the end, it's really an investment into European technologies, bringing the electric vehicle market up to speed, and especially in those groups that otherwise would have been left out, and bringing them kind of at eye level with the rest of the society. I'll close by touching on the European idea. Of course, it makes sense to bundle that policy instrument at the European level with, as you said, guidance on common criteria, ensuring volume and predictability. Overall, it will help to reduce the per-country overhead if it's initiated at the European level. But of course, the criteria in the end will need to be tailored to the respective needs in the countries, because they can be quite different.
Thank you very much, Peter. So without any further ado, I'll give the floor to Christianne.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this invitation. For us, social leasing is a promising concept, especially to make EVs more attractive for private buyers, but its success will depend on smart and practical implementation. And there are several key points we should consider from this start. First, this is not a cost-free measure. Leasing cars below market value is not sustainable for businesses. In France, part of the burden was shifted onto SMEs, which later required adjustments. And we should therefore look carefully at sustainable financing. Otherwise, no businesses are willing to participate. Second, implementation should build on local SMEs and existing national systems. It really should take into account local markets. An EU-wide pooling model may work for homogeneous projects, such as gas, but cars are different. The product is not homogeneous, national car markets are different, and consumers across Europe have different needs and preferences. And these vary strongly between member states. Third, residual values of electric vehicles are essential for affordable leasing. If too many similar vehicles enter and leave the first-hand market at the same time, second-hand prices could fall sharply, and with them the residual value. A phased approach and a balanced mix of vehicles will therefore be necessary. Fourth, investment in the electricity grid and charging infrastructure remains crucial. Lower-income households will rely mainly on public charging, even in countries like the Netherlands, where charging infrastructure is well developed. Businesses and consumers increasingly are facing capacity constraints. Finally, social leasing should not be discussed in isolation. It must be aligned with other EU proposals, including industrial and trading policy. Measures such as a possible Made in Europe label could have significant effects on this initiative. In short, social leasing has real potential, but only if it's affordable, in coordination with SMEs and part of a coherent European strategy. And at last, the first speaker, she mentioned a second-hand the second-hand cars. And I think it's really interesting for social leasing for second-hand cars. Batteries last longer than expected and are easier to repair. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you see, we have not invited only big fans of the social leasing scheme, but also people that are maybe more skeptical and underlining elements that remains to be tackled. So Christianne is working for the Dutch Association of Automobile Dealers. Just two quick things I wanted to underline while listening to you. So just to bring everybody up to speed on what is the business model of leasing companies. Essentially, a lot of leasing companies are owned by banks, and they have a financial approach to this, and the car is a very specific type of financial asset. It's an asset, I mean, it's one of the few financial assets that we know will lose value over time. And that's quite rare in finance, that you buy an asset knowing that it will lose value. So the way a leasing business, a typical leasing company business model works is that you buy a new car, and you will sell that car. So that's when Christianne was saying the residual value, that's the cost, or rather the money you make when you sell the car after 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And the idea is that you made more money over time through the lease than you lost through the loss of the residual value, and that's why it's quite important. And it's something that I'm actually quite convinced by going big on social leasing, precisely because the French experiment did some mistakes. And therefore we can learn from them and try to design this. And here again, what the EU needs to worry about is whether you can actually bring specific added value. And so that has to do with the type of model, the made in Europe, the more industry side. But then obviously when it comes to the details of the contract, how long should a leasing scheme be? Like, should it be like 3 years like in France? Should it be longer? Those are things obviously where national sovereignty can express itself. That's also the case for the charging infrastructure. The situation will be different. When I'm speaking of people that are rural workers, you don't need any charging infrastructure because you just charge at home. We're talking about the vast majority of rural workers own the home where they live. And since they only drive 100, 150 kilometers per day, they just need slow charging through the night. And so therefore, you don't need any kind of expansion of the grid. The existing grid, the existing charging infrastructure is already good enough. You need nothing, close to nothing. That would obviously be different for people who live in buildings that are co-owned, where here you would have a charging infrastructure issue that needs to be tackled either at the national level or at the local level. But here we're talking about a more urban part of the population, which is not the key target behind that group. The social leasing scheme is really first and foremost thought for rural workers. And in the vast majority of the European countries, that's obviously less true in the Netherlands, which is a more densely populated part. We're talking about people who actually own the home where they live and where they will charge. So let's continue the conversation, focusing on the consumer. I mean, we already talked about it a little, so I'll give the floor to Robin.
Thank you, and I would like to thank you and MEP Mohammed Chahim on addressing concrete example, because it relates to day-to-day experience of consumers, highlighting exactly what BOVAG is working on, the vulnerability of consumers. And this vulnerability is really expressed in the car market today. It's expressed by several factors. The first one, people don't buy new cars anymore because people cannot buy new cars anymore. And in response to that, the second-hand market has become very important to them. But the response from part of the industry has been to propose leasing as the default option for consumers looking to have a vehicle. And the examples we have from France, from our member UFC Que Choisir in France, really relates to that. In 2024, 66% of vehicles sold to private individuals were leasing contracts. Almost 2/3 of these vehicles were leasing contracts. So in the end, people do not own these vehicles really. Why this trend? As I said, because of high prices, because of strong marketing push, because of questions about the residual value and a willingness from car makers and leasing companies to increase profits over time, and a shift in strategy. Because of more expensive vehicles, there was a way, and it's pretty well documented, that demand has been dried out, and that because we still need to sell these vehicles, leasing has become the de facto option. But from our experience in France and from our members, UFC Que Choisir, have shown 25% of consumers under leasing contract had to pay fees at the end of their lease. And out of these 25%, the huge majority deemed these fees unjustified. And these fees are not small. It's 1,200 euros at the end of your lease that you need to pay, sometimes for very unjustified reasons. And the increase of leasing without purchase option is also detrimental to consumers. Because at the end of your lease, if you cannot even try to buy your car, you have to start again, and you still don't own your car. And so from the experience we have in France, and of course I'm talking about leasing, but that directly applies to social leasing because we're really talking about vulnerable consumers, there are a few elements that need to be considered. The right to cancellation in case of an accident in your life, pre-contractual information, clear pre-contractual information, targeting abusive clauses that still exist at scale on the leasing market, protect consumers also when they face a leasing contract without a purchase option. And that also applies to EU regulation and directives in place, protection to credit to consumers that are offered. But for social leasing, concretely, these examples are not enough. Longer lease have been discussed, and I think this is a very important issue. Consumers are expecting to own a car for a longer period of time. 3 years might not be enough for many of them. Targeting the right people is indeed very important, and in this respect, and that's something we have seen throughout policy mix around over the years, when you have to apply to something that is complicated, that is burdensome, you miss a lot of the people who should have a social leasing at hand. Charging is also important. I do agree with you on the charging pattern that we are looking at, but still we face high prices at public charging stations that should also be bundled up in these leasing offers. And most importantly, the right to repair your car with independent garages if you need to have a free choice for consumers. All of this is very important because at the end of the day, and I'll conclude with that, if we subsidize the car industry, again in Europe, it needs to come with clear trade-off, clear regulatory trade-off on social leasing, obviously, but also on other policies that are discussed today, notably CO2 standards for cars, notably how we target the second-hand market via corporate fleets electrifying at a much faster pace, because all this will target consumers and will finally reach out the volumes that we have lost. 4 million cars have been lost over the last 7 years, and it is not the fault of consumers, it's the fault of prices of cars being higher and higher over the day. And a final word on EU preference. We do believe at BOVAG that the French scheme relying on ADEME, so the Environment Agency, to call it bluntly in France, to basically put out there what are the criteria, without strong market intervention, really drives the market in the right way. You don't need to discuss so many made in EU criteria, where to apply the battery. No, we can design that at national level under the right criteria. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Without any further ado, I'll give the floor to Judith from industriAll.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the invitation, and also thanks very much for the framing of this whole initiative as a response to the reality that workers in Europe find themselves in, because we're on both sides of this story. We're not just auto workers facing an enormous systemic crisis in our industry with I would remind historic levels of restructuring, job losses, and a major social challenge for automotive workers across Europe. Also with tens of thousands of workers already and still in short-time working arrangements or in temporary unemployment arrangements. Currently, we have half of Italian automotive workers in solidarity arrangements, as an example. So we urgently, the reason why we're very, very active supporters of the Clean Industrial Deal, of the automotive package, and the IAA, that we need a strong demand-side action at European level. And there are positive things in the automotive package. We're strong advocates of the corporate fleets rules. We obviously have to see how these all dovetail. But the missing piece of the puzzle is this question of social leasing, in our view, because we're not dealing with that other side of our existence, which is that we don't see ourselves as consumers. We see ourselves also as workers who need vehicles for their daily life, as both you, Thomas, and Mo have set out with concrete examples of workers finding that way. So for us, this initiative is really extremely important for three reasons. For the first, it's the missing piece of the puzzle. It deals with the market failure of the fact that there is a whole set of workers that are car dependent, as Peter said, but have very little option in an economy and a marketplace where cars are unaffordable. And the whole pressure has been to increase heavier and more expensive vehicles over time. Transport poverty is a real reality in Europe, and we're seeing an aging fleet as a result of that. In some parts of Europe, the kind of Cuberization of the car market is a reality. And we know for environmental reasons, but also for the social sustainability, we need to address that. So the social leasing proposal we see as very important. We see it as very important to do at European level for exactly the reasons that you laid out, of creating the scale and of creating the predictability across the whole of the European industrial chain as well. We obviously, it won't come as any surprise, are very strong advocates of Made in Europe criteria, but we don't see Made in Europe as a geographical criteria. We think that the Made in Europe criteria should be a stamp of quality. So it should also come, as was said right at the beginning by Iratxe in the introduction, with social conditionalities attached in terms of respect for working conditions, respect for collective bargaining, ensuring that there are not excessive dividends and profits made. We obviously want companies to be making profits, but we have seen historically high profits made on the back of workers in the automotive sector. And we need to ensure, and there it's maybe slightly in contradiction to what other people have said, but we also need to ensure that we're creating Made in Europe criteria which support the full value chain in Europe, and not just the presence of screwdriver factories in the European territory. So that is about a social contract. Every pound, no, I shouldn't say pounds anymore, sorry. Every cent, every euro of public money should deliver a payback to the taxpayer. And in some ways, the social leasing proposal is that triple dividend, also addressing that market failure. My last comment is just a very important point. Maria started with setting out the kind of the framework that we find ourselves in, the underlying challenges. I don't think we can talk about dealing with social leasing or measures to deal with transport poverty without talking about the sources of that transport poverty. We have a very deep cost of living crisis in Europe that is going to accelerate now in the context of what is happening in the Persian Gulf and the impact on energy prices. And that's why this is exactly the kind of measure at this time to show a signal to people in Europe that actually, and to those who are the most vulnerable in Europe, that Europe has their back. And that there is an understanding that we have to deal with that cost of living crisis, raising wages. In more than half of European countries, real wages are still below 2019 levels. And so if we don't tie up our social policy agenda with our environmental and our industrial policy agenda, we're really missing a key opportunity to steer Europe in the right direction. But we also, in that light, I would just reinforce the point that not everyone has access to their home charger. So dealing with charging prices, dealing with electricity prices is also part of that overall framework to show that workers, whether they're dependent on their car or whether they're dependent on making the car, that Europe has their back. And we see this as the missing piece of the puzzle. So we're delighted to stand here and support the proposal. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to start a quick discussion amongst ourselves. First, I want to give everybody the opportunity to react to one of the things that you heard other speakers say. So feel free to take the floor if you want to react to anything that another panelist said and that triggered you. You want to go? Yeah.
Well, to be honest, you triggered me with your two comments, and about the residual value, because a lot of leasing companies are SMEs. It's not only owned by banks, and they are often locally owned. So the residual value is an important part of the total leasing price, and both have to be right, I think. Well, the second point about charging at home, you also mentioned it in rural areas. I think that lower income households will also have to depend on a public charging infrastructure. For example, because they live in apartment blocks, and which we have in all the areas in our country. So the households who can charge at home are, I think, the most wealthy people. So I think it's very, very important.
So I'm sorry, I don't know the data for the Netherlands, and I understand the Netherlands to be a very densely populated place, but for like the people, so people who live in rural areas tend to earn less than people who live in urban areas, and people who live in rural areas tend to own the home that they have. That is, in Romania, the ownership is 97% for everything, including apartment building blocks. And the importance of the car is much less, obviously, in urban areas than in local ones. But happy to have more data there. But here again, this is the typical type of discussion that needs to happen at the national level to understand the national context, if not the regional context. So I'm just underlining these elements. What we know from the French experience is that the vast majority of people either never charge on public charging, or very rarely, or in a more opportunistic manner. Typically, people will go grocery shopping at Lidl. Lidl has been having public charging as a way to attract customer to the supermarket, but this is actually quite marginal, frankly speaking. We're talking about people who don't use the highway because it depends on the country here again. So some highways are free, but in most countries in Europe, you need to pay for the highway, and those people do not even take the highway just because of the cost. So you don't even need to have public charging on the highway for the type of people that we're focusing on when it comes to social leasing. Maybe one last point, I think that's a critical element. The type of people who benefit from social leasing are very different from the typical new car buyer. Again, I'm using French data because, to my knowledge, EU consolidated data does not exist on that. But the average car buyer, when we talk about an individual, in France is 54 years old and earns more than 4,000 euros a month. So that's 2 times the median wage in France. The average user of the first French experiment on social leasing, the average age is 35-year-old, so much younger than the average person, and earns around 1,000 euros per month. So we're talking about a very, very, very different group, which is also what, and it's going to be the second panel chaired by my colleague Annalisa, it's also why this is actually such a good piece of news for the automotive industry, because social leasing comes on top. It is additional to the existing car market that will continue, because the people that will benefit from social leasing are people that will never buy a new car in their life, even a petrol car for that matter. And so to me that is critical, and a lot of the discussion we're having in Brussels are skewed, let's say, by our own sociological biases. This is not a criticism. Everybody has a bias, like everybody has biases. It is life. But I think it's important to put ourselves in the headspace of what are the lives that the people who will benefit from social leasing are, and those are lives that don't take you actually far away from home. You don't drive 800 kilometers to go to the Côte d'Azur or whatever, and those are not the lives of people who pay for the highway. Those are not the lives of people that will use public charging. So we really need to start from that specific group that is clearly not well represented in the European Parliament, sociologically, but that is well represented among the working class in Europe. Any other speakers who wanted to react on elements? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, maybe I found this panel to be rather uncontroversial. I think no one has said here that we are against social leasing.
Right. You can underline something that
we'll agree. It's just, of course, the how that is probably where the discussion needs to take place. And I think from our perspective, the more let's say the more modalities, the more requirements then you attach to those conditions, criteria, the more complicated all those social leasing schemes tend to become. I mean, for example, this focus on size, is that really justifiable? I mean, if we talk about low-income, vulnerable groups, why do we assume, and maybe there is data, and I'm being completely biased here, but why do we assume that those people would be satisfied, or their needs will be met with a small car? I mean, we just heard the story, a very moving story of Mr. Chahim and his 6 siblings. I'm not sure whether that family would fit in a small car. So I think the main message here is the more narrow we make the scope, the more complicated, the less models will be eligible for this scheme, the less people will actually use this social leasing scheme, because simply they won't find what they're looking for, what meets their requirements in those national schemes.
Peter, you wanted to react also?
Yeah, I had the same point that Maria had, that it was a very harmonious panel, and I think there's broad support for this leasing scheme. I hear some nuances in the perspectives, for example, on the vans and small enterprises. My personal take is that it's really, like, basically we are in the midst of a crisis, so it's very important to act quickly to help those people who are affected the most by the high prices. And so I would probably opt more on the side of making it relatively simple, narrow, and just focusing on private consumers for now, and then adding in the second phase eventually vans and medium enterprise or small enterprises, and really just act quickly. That's the point I would like to make.
Anyone else? Otherwise, oh yeah, Judith. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the point is maybe a detailed point, but I think it's a very important point for the practical experience. Having had an electric car on a lease and knowing the trauma of taking the car back at the end of the lease, I think this point about the transparency of contracts, conditions, and ensuring that that is laid out in some way, if it's not in detail, but in within the scheme, is actually very important for people's confidence to be able to enter into a scheme. Yeah.
Okay. Can you raise your arm if you have a question in the audience? Because I still have some questions, but I would be happy to give you the floor if you have any. Giorgio.
Thank you, Thomas. I would like to make a question in Italian, if I can. La domanda riguarda.
My question has to do with the whole way that this would be set up, the architecture, if you like, based partly on the French experience, but amended. One point that would be very different from the French initiative would be that the orders would be given by the public sector for 10 million cars over a 5-year period, whereas in the French initiative, the government set the rules and provided the incentives. I think it was 13,000 over a 3-year period. Well, if the public sector plays that role, then they're also taking on board the risk that goes with it. And what happens if the leasing scheme doesn't work? what if the 10 million cars aren't, well, there's no take-up, or not all of them. So I think the goal of this scheme is very clear. Pooling provides certainty to the automobile industry, helps keep costs down, but within the very mechanism, there is a problem, I think, for the member states. And so I would ask you, and anyone who would like to answer, whether you think that it's going to be vital that this be something borne by the public sector. And on the costs of this, obviously there would be European funding, but do you think the individual member states would also have to contribute?
So Giorgio is also a member of the European Parliament, also in the Trade Committee. Maybe Peter, do you want to react to this, or?
I was hoping that in the second panel there would be a stronger focus on the financing side. I think I will pass. It's not really my expertise.
Okay, so to quickly answer your question, Giorgio, unless anybody else wants to, okay, yeah.
Thanks. That's indeed a very interesting question, and I think it relates to some of the points Thomas said previously. The patchwork of different subsidies, as briefly explained, I think is problematic. And I think the Italian scheme with up to 13,000 euro to subsidize a car, it's not as efficient as it can be. And in many member states, you have what we call the stop and go mechanisms, where you have a scheme that lasts for 2 months, 3 months, that get cancelled because of elections, because of a new year budget. You have different types of schemes and different priorities and different publics that are set up. And I think that's the strength of the proposal like this, to at least harmonize the basics of who we target, what level of support we bring to cars, and what cars we support. Then, of course, if member states want to have specificities on the public they target, for example, on distance, then we have something that is at least harmonized. I wouldn't fear a lack of demand, because the success and all the schemes that have been deployed over the years have shown the real demand. The average age of a car in Europe is getting older and older, and so there's a tremendous demand to renew the fleet, and the scrappage schemes is also something that needs to be put in place. So I wouldn't be scared of a lack of demand or risks in this scheme, because the demand is there. We've lost for 6-7 years now 4 million cars that usually are sold, new cars. So there's companies and consumers, but that trickles down to the second-hand market that is being dried out as well. So there is a demand, clearly.
And to add, so do you have to do a pooling at the EU level? You do not have to. There is no obligation to do that. However, the reason why we think it's a good idea is because it allows, so I already mentioned the budgetary element, but it's really about providing visibility for the industry. One of the things that made the social leasing scheme in France underwhelming, to use that word, is precisely the stop and go. So the French government started in January 2024. The subsidy was very big at the time. You mentioned the figure, Giorgio, so 13,000 euros per car. It was extremely successful, and the French government stopped after a few weeks. And they had no plan to reopen it until, I think, September 2025, so a year and a half later. And they improved the scheme there. And so that kind of stop and go, I mean, it's true for the car industry, it's true for renewables, it's true for building renovation. That's the worst thing you can do when you want to transform. And as it was said by Maria, the idea of the social leasing is to be one component of a broader policy that we should have in the EU to accompany the transitions towards the electrification of cars, because, to quote Ursula von der Leyen, electric cars are the future. Back to the audience. Anyone else who wants? I'm just being mindful of time. Does anyone else have questions? Can you raise your arm if you have a question? I see one gentleman in the front. Anybody else? Okay, so we're going to take the 2 questions, and then I'll give you the floor. Okay. So the gentleman in the front.
Hi, good morning. My name is Tanveer. I work with the Industry Association for Automotive Manufacturers. First of all, thank you to MEP Chahim and to the S&D for organizing this event. Slightly convoluted question, but nonetheless, in a research paper I read recently a while ago on deterministic principles focusing on necessary and sufficient conditions to bring about a jump. It was authored by Hartelcourt, and the first author's name escapes me. He may be in the room over here, who mentioned that it is important to have sufficient conditions to jump towards a new technology. Social leasing currently is being viewed as as a point where technology is jumping towards transition towards EVs and more proliferation of EVs, of course. But the focus in social leasing continues to be on lowering the value and leasing cost for the consumers that you're trying to target. The larger difficulty in these same consumers you're trying to target is ensuring that they have the cost to also make the jump that includes the price of home-based charging, the time cost and the opportunity of charging, and having infrastructure that ensures that you can charge at competitive prices. MEP Carlin, you just mentioned that a lot of people do not depend on highways. They don't go on charging and they don't go on highways. Yes, if you are targeting the consumers that are not going on highways, who are using their vehicles for everyday usage within the highway, where charging infrastructure may not be as ubiquitous, how can social leasing schemes potentially extend also to include affordability through availability of infrastructure at homes for the consumers that we are targeting? Because if we don't do that, while you bring down leasing costs at the dealer, let's say, you are not bringing down the entire adoptability cost of the vehicle, and that would still prove to be a stumbling block for people to want to engage in the scheme.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman in the back? Yeah.
Hello, if possible, I would like to ask my question in French. Donc c'est peut-être une question.
Well, this question maybe is more for Madame Linkova-Nijs. My question is the link between keeping new car prices high for larger vehicles rather than plumping for smaller ones, which would be less expensive, and the fact that on the second-hand market, leasing would be financing those vehicles too. So that would seem to me that, in fact, that there is a responsibility nonetheless to develop smaller vehicles. And what does García think about that possibility?
You want to go first? Try to be brief because we need to close in 3 minutes.
Yeah, so I think also on leasing, in our second panel, we have better experts to talk about residual values and all of this. But obviously, we operate in the market economy. There are needs, people who need big cars, who need small cars, who need cheaper models, who need more premium models. As long as there is a customer demand for those specific vehicles, of course, manufacturers will be producing for that demand. So I think that's probably the only answer that I can give because we're very much driven by consumer demand, not really the other way around. And so the question is, how do we ensure that consumers, how to ensure that electric vehicles become the most attractive choice for consumers?
Thank you. I see Robin disagreeing. Robin, you will be the last. You have the last word from that panel.
To answer to the gentleman first, yes, charging for us needs also to be packed into this bundle of offers, and of course supporting home chargers and tackling the high prices at public charging station is key. It's a philosophical answer to Maria, but supply and demand do not work like economy classes. I think consumers are really, really, really much shaped by the offer they get. Supply shapes demand. It has been quite well documented also in literature, but it's not only consumer demand. Otherwise, we would see new vehicles being sold much more than they are today.
Yeah. Okay, so to conclude, I went into politics 2 years ago. Before that, I was a researcher, and indeed, in research, you see that, and you see that especially for the people used the word need, which was interesting. Some consumers do not need cars, they want cars, and those are two different things, needing and wanting. And here again, social leasing is really tailored for people who actually need a car. People for whom the car is first and foremost a mode of transportation. There's a different customer group for whom the car is mostly a social status symbol, and those tend to be the people with the highest willingness to pay, as we know. So to conclude, what we gathered from that panel is that there is a lot of debate to be had, but what I gather is that we have a broad support for the idea of a European social leasing scheme. That support is coming from both trade union, consumer organization, automotive dealership, researchers on transportation, and the European Car Maker Association. But obviously a lot of debate to be had on the details. How long is the lease? How do we deal with the residual value? We will continue that discussion in the second panel, but I'm glad that we start to have it, to be honest. This is the first time I am at a panel where there is such a level of detail of discussion in Brussels. So I think it's long overdue, and I think the Commission is partially guilty of that because they've not proposed anything. And so I'm looking forward for the Commission to propose something as part of the Electrification Action Plan, and there hopefully we can have a debate on, let's say, the details, because the devil is indeed in the details, but the type of details we need to answer to at the EU level, and the type of elements where it will be national and regional authorities that can actually deal with that level of detail. So please join me in thanking the panelists. And I give the floor back to Georgia.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Thomas, the moderator, and all the speakers for this insightful discussion. We will now move to the second panel, just a couple of minutes for a quick coffee, and we will restart the session. Thanks a lot. Welcome back. Please take a seat. We will restart in a minute. We will now begin our second panel, Market and Industrial Implication of Social Leasing. This panel will be moderated by the MEP Annalisa Corrado, which is a very active member as well in the ITRE and EV committee. I will now give the floor to Annalisa. Our speakers are already here. Thanks a lot to all of you to moderate this panel discussion.
Thank you very much. I will always use Italian for a brief introduction and then English to moderate the panel. So let's give you the time to put on the ear. Okay. So, grazie.
Thank you. Genuine thanks to you for attending. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to the S&D group for having been so determined and committed in supporting this process, this whole procedure, which is absolutely vital. And thank you so much to Mohammed for all the work he's done on this, for all the energy and effort he's put into it. And it's become even more necessary because we're living through very difficult times, as you know. And that's the case for all of our green policies, our policies towards the green transition. We are under attack from the right as well, which has broken through on social media, normal media, and has, we think, very wrongly cast the green transition, the Green Deal, as something setting the brakes on the growth of the economy and industry in Europe. We have the facts to prove that's wrong. We've got the figures, we've got the facts, we've got the studies, particularly in the automotive sector, which is one of the sectors where we've seen this ideological fight going on, even using fake news, using extremely skewed figures and studies. Now, we've heard about the difficulties of people who have lost their jobs from factories, and not just the factories themselves, but people downstream as well, who've suddenly lost their jobs because of the economic problems we have. So there is a structural problem with the industry, but skewed analyses and proposals really don't help to solve the problem. If you throw the blame on the transition, if you throw the blame for what's happening to our industry onto EVs, then you're not taking into account, to give just one example, that the international market that the European industry thought it would be selling its cars in was suddenly flooded by Chinese cars, just to give one example. So there's no genuine correlation between the transition and the problems our industries are facing. So that whole right-wing ideological diagnosis is wrong, but that doesn't mean that there aren't problems. Let me repeat, though, that we have to admit that we do still have to do something, and refusing to do so is just going to make the situation worse. So this proposal we're discussing today is a kind of beacon that we can use to light up new proposals whereby we can do more things together, where we contribute to the reindustrialization of our supply and production chains. I'm Italian, I know how important automobile manufacturing is, as it is in many countries. But we need new designs, new projects. The same with EVs, for example, where there's not just necessarily one product chain. There are also other forms of technology involved in the automotive industry that then could be transferred and used elsewhere too. We need to ensure that the automotive industry is a beacon that can then be used across the board for other industries. We need quality jobs. We need sustainable jobs, future-facing, for an industry that's not collapsing, but that should be growing. And we have to ensure that this isn't just in the hands of people who've got the money to carry out skewed analyses or sophisticated analyses. We have to ensure that there's a sense of ownership amongst ordinary people too, because it's their lives that are affected too. Mohammed gave an example earlier on access to solar panels for his mother. And I thought that was a brilliant example, because I think that made it clear that the most sophisticated technology becomes real to normal people when they can afford it. And I think the point has been made that the green transition will be seen to be a success when ordinary people take it on board. So the green transition has the potential to change people's lives for the better, particularly the most vulnerable, those that have difficulties, those who in these very difficult times have to choose, am I going to pay the rent? Am I going to pay my electricity bill? Or am I going to try to use a public health service, or shall I go private because I can't get public health? So I think this proposal that we're working on is one of the most brilliant solutions that we can come up with at this point and make available to people. Because, as I said, EVs have caused a huge debate against the Green Deal. And we've got a problem as Europeans. The solution to mobility has to be public mobility. We've always said that. And we need public transport. We also need electric cars, but on the public transport point of view, we need more buses, we need more trains, we need more trams, we need more electric trams and buses. And we need more freight going by public transport. But it's also true, as we've heard, a lot of citizens live in the countryside, areas with not much or not good public transport. And if they don't have their own car, then they can't live their daily lives, their daily working lives. So cars are still vital and will still be vital for many years. And as such, it's essential we open the market up to small and medium-sized EVs. And I know there are other tools that the European Union's developing to do that too. And as these start to be bought by companies as fleets, hopefully as well, the newer models will come onto the second-hand market, which is also vital if we're going to develop this whole sector and see it grow. So in this panel discussion, we're going to be looking more at the industrial implications and the market implications of this kind of social leasing scheme that we're working on together. End of the Italian introduction, start of the moderation in English.
Let's shift. As Socialist and Democrat, we believe that social leasing offers a triple win, as we said, people, planet, and industry. In this panel, we will zoom in on the latter, industry. The key questions we will work on or we will discuss on are, more or less, what wins can a social leasing scheme bring across the automotive value chain? How we can ensure that social leasing serves as an accelerator for clean tech development in Europe? How can social leasing play a role in creating quality jobs? And what implication and knock-on effects can we expect on the second-hand market? These are questions I'm sure the panelists will be able to shed their light on. Joining this panel are Eva Schultz, member of the cabinet of Executive Vice President Roxana Mînzatu. Welcome, thank you for being here. Ludovic Voet, Voet, more or less, okay. I've written the pronunciation, but I'm not sure that. Confederal Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation. Richard Knubben, no, that side, hello. Director General of LEASE Europe. Ioana Petcu, Public Affairs Director at e-Mobility Europe. And Lucien Mathieu, Director Cars at Transport and Environment. So thank you all for joining us today. Without further time, I will turn immediately to our speakers. So let's start with Eva. I'm happy to hear from you on how you have read the S&D demands on social leasing and see the discussion on social leasing become more apparent in the light of rising fuels prices and the international crisis we are facing. So the floor is yours for your opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation, honorable members, colleagues, partners, friends. It's good to be here for today's discussion, and thank you for pointing out the three elements of our discussion: people, planet, industry. And even if we zoom in on the later one, I think on behalf of my executive vice president, I need to start with people. She always starts there and finishes there with a strong focus on the people. I was mentioning as I came in, and I think it goes for several of the panelists, that I just came from another panel where we discussed issues that cannot be enough underlined and addressed today, which goes for the inclusion angle of people most exposed to poverty, affordability issues, and the risk of social exclusion, but at the same time, how to safeguard our industrial production, including with a strong focus on quality jobs in Europe. So I think that gives me the starting point for some introductory remarks from Commission side and on behalf of my Executive Vice President and the Cabinet, working together, of course, with our services on this. And with that starting point, I can very much agree with the key points, the key demands that you put forward here in terms of the role that social leasing can play to support our efforts in terms of safeguarding industrial production in Europe with a strong focus on ensuring quality jobs, as I said, in terms of focusing on the people, tackling transport poverty for low-income households, and at the same time contribute to the longer-term objective of accelerating decarbonization and ensuring the clean transition, not least and in particular, as today's discussion focuses on the road transport, automotive sector, and contributing to strengthening energy security. I think, as you said, we are at a crucial point in time with peaking energy prices and our everyday focus being put to the energy crisis, this time triggered by the situation in the Middle East. But it's not the first time, and we need to keep that in our clear focus. You know that the Commission will be coming tomorrow with communication, which is part of its response to the energy crisis and what we can do both in the short term and in the longer term in terms of accelerating the EU Energy Union. But before that, I wanted to point in a few directions where I think that's some conditions are needed, some requirements are needed to make a social leasing scheme successful. And of course, as always, we work through different policies, different initiatives in different areas. But from EVP Mînzatu's side and our team's side, we try in every one of these initiatives to keep our focus on ensuring that quality jobs, social cohesion go hand in hand with economic prosperity and at the same time a clear route towards clean transition. You saw in the automotive package that came before Christmas and in the Industrial Accelerator Act after Christmas that there was a strong emphasis on made in EU. Local content or EU content requirements, we believe, is the right way to go to make sure that we safeguard, boost, secure continued industrial production in Europe, not least in the automotive sector. So there's been a strong alliance between EVP Séjourné putting forward the Industrial Accelerator Act and my EVP, Roxana Mînzatu, in securing a focus on jobs in Europe when it comes to industrial acceleration. So that's a clear condition in this context as well. When we zoom into social leasing, and as we've also seen in the discussions on the automotive package and the question of using social leasing in that context, we believe that we need to target low-income households, that we have seen from experience that initiatives may have benefited more the middle-income homes and households. Not bad, of course, but in this context where we're focusing or seeing a greater exposure of the most marginalized groups, such a scheme needs to focus on the low-income households. Because, of course, as you are well aware, there are substantial costs involved, and we need to identify the instruments that can be used on a European level. The Social Climate Fund, of course, a clear choice, but also the Innovation Fund through the Battery Booster Facility, for example. And you will see in what we come with in the Accelerate EU initiative, a clear focus on both mobilizing public funding or public means in combination with boosting private investment. And I think there is a win-win from both ends in this context, so it is a clear focus here as well. When we talk about vehicles, electric vehicles, we need to ensure affordability. So I mentioned the EU content requirements, which we believe are important, but at the same time, not at the cost, at the expense of the price. So this is why, from the Commission side, at the same time, we've focused on developing a small affordable cars initiative to fuel the production in a certain direction that can also help in terms of affordability. Access to skills is another clear requirement and condition. Businesses have come since the beginning of the mandate and keep doing so to the Executive Vice President calling for efforts, initiatives to address the big skills and labor gaps that exist. And there is no contradiction, of course. Well, seemingly there is perhaps a contradiction, but between jobs being lost and skills and labor gaps existing at the same time. But we need to be able to keep these two thoughts in mind at the same time and address the skills needs, which is why we have come with a pilot in the first phase, but hope to evolve and elaborate this further in terms of the EU Skills Guarantee. It's part of the Union of Skills initiative to address the reskilling, upskilling needed in a transition phase, the transition being the clean transition, but also talking about an industrial transition, putting many workers exposed to job losses. And here we think that the skills guarantee, but other initiatives as well, through the proposed modifications of the European Globalization Adjustment Fund, for example, or the Automotive Skills Alliance, can help. But much more is needed. We all see that and we understand that. And this is why we work with a much broader scope and in a broader context when we talk about the Quality Jobs Act that will come later this year, the labor mobility package coming in the autumn, but also, as I said, in the context of the longer term discussion on the transition to homegrown clean energy. And coming back to where we stand now, I think we put focus from EVP Mînzatu's side in what the Commission comes with tomorrow on the short-term needs, on keeping the immediate needs for relief for consumers, for households, the ones most exposed. We keep our focus now on this without forgetting and at the same time contributing to the longer term developments. And in this context, I think the social leasing scheme, including with your key demands, come very handy. And I'm also grateful for the opportunity to be here today and discuss further. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I think your speech demonstrates that this kind of proposal could have an effect on several strategies we are focusing on. So really interesting. Thank you very much. And now I will give the floor to Ludovic Voet, Confederal Secretary at the European Trade Union. And how does your organization follow the discussion on social leasing, and what are the accents that are important to your organization? Of course, you can also say something different, but this should be the first point. 5 minutes if possible, so we can have some time for a discussion later. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. We'll do my best for the 5 minutes. So let me start thanking you for the initiative on social leasing. It's extremely important and very welcome debate. It addresses for us a fundamental question. How do we ensure the green transition is not only fast, but also fair? So there I see 4 very positive elements behind. First, it recognizes a social reality. For millions of workers, mobility is not a choice, it is a necessity. Today, access to clean mobility is deeply unequal, and by putting social leasing on the table, you're acknowledging that the transition must include those who would otherwise be left behind. Second, it tries to bridge the gap between climate ambition and affordability. Electric vehicles, for the moment, remain too expensive for most households. Social leasing is an attempt to make this transition accessible. Third, it opens the door to a European approach. If we want scale and fairness, national schemes alone will not be enough. And fourth, this is industrial policy that match the social and labor dimension, or as you said, the people, planet, and industry dimension. Because as a summary, what you can't buy, you can't produce on the long term. So if people are not able to afford, we're not able on the long term to produce in Europe. So this is the right debate. I want also to bring different elements on conditions for success. First, we have a problem with the fiscal reality. A meaningful scheme requires strong public support, yet many member states are facing tight fiscal constraints. With restrictive rules, the space for large-scale investment is limited, so there is a risk, high ambition, but insufficient means. So we need to address this too. Social leasing, if not, social leasing will remain too small to have real impact. Second, the reality of income of people. We often speak about low and middle income households and as if it was a small group, but would like to bring also the reality of the 6th, 7th, and 8th income decile of the population in the EU. The 6th income decile earns around 23K per year in Europe. The 7th income decile, 26K. The 8th income decile, 31K. So this is the majority of the population. If you take the 50% of the most vulnerable and middle income. And for them, you will have understood, major investments are simply not affordable neither. We've already shown in a recent publication that for energy renovation, for most decile of the population, it's more than 100% of your yearly wage that you would have to invest in the renovation of your home. If you add the electrification of your mobility to this, you see the social challenge that it is. So I think it's important. As a short term, it's possible, of course, to start with the most vulnerable, but I think we should not forget that that 80% of the population is not in will not have easy affordability to electric vehicles. Third, infrastructure. We cannot push electric mobility without the necessary infrastructure, and we have seen that since the fiscal rules have been constrained, the take-up of charging networks by individuals and by companies has also clearly diminished. If we want really to accelerate the take-up of electric vehicles, you need also the charging networks and grid capacity that is still insufficient in many regions. And if we don't push this, this will create inequalities and frustration. Fourth and last, the industrial and market dimension. For sure, a strong, important debate here to push is the Made in Europe approach that has to be consubstantial to the social leasing approach. But I want also to bring a complementary dimension, is that affordability is not only about subsidies, it's about prices. And here, I think that we have to be clear that affordable electric vehicles are technically possible. The issue is not the technology, it's also the current market model and choices by manufacturers that do produce larger, more expensive vehicles because they generate higher margins. So if we subsidize demands without changing this, we risk subsidizing profits. This would not be acceptable, so we need to find a way that public money is used to finance affordable electric vehicles. And in this case, with a public scheme, you guarantee the demand. It also means that for manufacturers, they have the certainty of production on the long term, so they should not put margins that are unacceptable. And in France, for example, one of the industry union in the automotive sector made an estimation of the cost of an electric vehicle, how they could produce, at which cost they could produce it. They said 15K. The problem is that it's not at this price because of the margin that is done by the company. So this is possible, and we can accept that there's a margin of profit that exists, but there's a discussion if there's public support on the price that these cars should have. So let me conclude. This debate is not only about a leasing scheme, of course, or electric vehicle. It's clearly about the kind of transition we want. Behind social leasing, there is really the possibility to build an emancipatory and protective project for Europeans and European workers, a project where citizens are no longer trapped in mobility poverty but have access to affordable and clean transport, a project with cleaner air and better living conditions, and a project where millions of industrial jobs are created and maintained in Europe, jobs that workers can be proud of. And this is an important element also in the political situation. This is an opportunity in front of us. It requires political choice, and I thank you a lot for pushing this debate in the political sphere.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much also for mentioning the question of the big dimension of cars and the big dimension of profits. That exactly one of the reasons why our industry is in this kind of problems. And I didn't mention it because I choose only one to put another one on the table. So thank you very much. Now, the turn of Richard Knubben, the LEASE Europe. So, moving to LEASE Europe, you would assume that the organization with LEASE in its name would be the one of the most vocal supporters of social leasing. I'm happy to hear if that is correct. Can you tell us how LEASE Europe use social leasing and the S&D demands? also in 5 minutes. I know that.
I'll do my best. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm the Director General of both Lease Europe and Eurofinas, which represents the consumer finance industry at European level, which is also relevant. I'll get to that in a minute. It seems to me that social leasing is being used as a silver bullet to solve an incredible amount of problems at the same time. But what I haven't actually heard yet so far is what we're actually talking about. I haven't heard anybody define what leasing is. And this is, I think, where the problem starts a little bit. So, I mean, we have B2C leases, which are operating leases. So the vehicle is returned to the leasing company. The leasing company takes on the residual value risk. But we also have leases where there's an option to purchase or a guaranteed transfer of ownership. Now, in the French scheme, for example, about a third of the contracts were what they call LOA. So the ownership of the vehicle was transferred to the consumer. In that case, it is fully covered under the new Consumer Credit Directive. So it's actually consumer finance. It's not a lease. And it's regulated completely differently. If you're talking about the other kind of lease, I mean, the leasing company itself is subject to lots of prudential supervisory rules. Now, we have leasing companies that are bank-owned, as was pointed out earlier on. But we also have, for example, in Germany, a huge amount of leasing companies that are not bank-owned, which still will need to get funding through banks. They may not be ECB regulated, but they're regulated through a different financial regulator. So we have very strict eligibility requirements for issuing a lease or a loan, whether it's CCD regulation or it isn't. And I think this is where the first issue sort of starts. You're continuously talking about pushing cars towards the lowest income segments. But if you look at the CCD2, we have very strict creditworthiness assessments in Article 18 of the CCD. A lot of the people that seem to be discussed so far, probably they would not pass a credit check under the CCD2. And that's not something that we could just say, oh, well, let's not do that, right? So there's a whole European regulatory framework that is, at least on paper, a lot stricter than what I've heard today, what the plan would be regarding social leasing. Now, in a lease itself, what matters is the acquisition price, obviously, repair and maintenance, operating cost, and residual value cost. Now, somebody will carry that residual value risk. It's either the leasing company, if we have talking about an operating lease, or a consumer, if there is a transfer of ownership. Either way, you're pushing that risk onto one of those entities, and you're stressing the system in a way. So especially if you are transferring ownership, you need to consider that you're actually pushing long-term financial obligations on a consumer who may not actually be able to carry that financial risk, and you may actually increase the vulnerability of those consumers. So that is not something to easily move around. Now, the French scheme focused on roughly 150 euros a month. That was excluding insurance, right? So you have a 150 euro payment, but then you have another 150 euros a month in insurance that you have to add in, and then later on, you're stuck with the asset that you may or may not be able to resell. So it's not that straightforward, I would say. And I mean, if we take again the first French round, it was a 13,000 euro subsidy per contract. Obviously, the government ran out of money pretty quickly because that's a huge amount of money. If you look at, let's say, your average AB model electric car, you're selling it for 26,000 euros. I read in your paper that it would be a subsidy of 4,000 euros. Even a 20,000 euro car, you can't really lease for 150 euros a month. You have a financing problem there. So I haven't really heard solutions to how that will be addressed. Now, the enabling conditions are not something to be just ignored. I mean, I live in the southern part of the Netherlands, where every day I now see ads run by Enexis, which is the grid operator, telling me to put my washing machine on when it's sunny, because otherwise I might collapse the grid where I live. That is a reality as well. And yes, you can aim to buy millions of extra cars, but you can't just ignore the enabling conditions and the supportive grid that goes behind it. And even in a country like the Netherlands, we have a very substantial problem there. Now, I also actually have a question. I read in the paper that it discusses pooling of acquisitions. Does that mean the government would buy the cars in huge amounts and then get funding for those cars? And how would that work? How would that work together with financial institutions? Because I haven't heard any explanation there either. So, I mean, I guess that brings me back to my point. It's very difficult for me to comment because it's not clear to me what we're talking about. And depending on the details, I mean, they really matter. And each set of details come with its own regulatory requirements that we have to live up to. We can't just ignore. I think we need to start with that, and then we can have a further discussion.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's really important to have a discussion with all the partners, exactly because we want all the question come out in order to put it in the final version of the proposal, because it's a very pragmatic proposal, and we want to assess every single question. So thank you very much for focusing in this one. We are talking about leasing, not loans. So it is very clear also because in the 5 years we have not to put all the value of the car, but we also consider this as a strategy to create a second market, no? As we said. But I don't want to jump into the discussion. Just to a quick exchange, and because I'm really sorry, but we have not so much time. And to Ioana, e-mobility Europe. Your members operate across the e-mobility value chain. Maybe you can have a little introduction of which is the focus of your association. I'm curious to hear what social leasing could mean to them. The floor is yours, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. No, good morning, everyone. It's still morning, almost. My name is Ioana Petcu. I recently joined e-mobility Europe as Public Affairs Director. e-mobility Europe is the association of the, electromobility ecosystem, I would say. We have members that are active from mine to battery manufacturing, to EV manufacturing, charging stations, utilities. So basically from mine to plug, to go in the right direction. So we have companies that produce batteries, companies that produce vehicles, companies that produce infrastructure. So that's the point that I would like to bring today. But I will also like to bring the point from myself as a consumer. I used to drive a diesel vehicle. When the US attacked Iran, the price of diesel went from €1.60 at the pump to €2.20. So in a matter of days, I was exposed to a very, very big price fluctuation, and I felt the consequences of our oil dependence. I was fortunate enough to receive a company car, which is electric. And since then, I charged for less than €20. Which is a significant difference. And the point that I would like to bring is that we need supply and demand measures, especially this kind of measures that support customers, be them on the low income side or on the higher income side. So fleet operators and company cars generally go to people that are more in the high income side, I would say. Maybe another positive news that I would like to bring is that in the first quarter of this year, there were over 500,000 electric vehicles registered in 15 key markets in Europe. And with these 500,000 vehicles, we managed to displace 2 million barrels of oil. So this is a significant implication of the electrification and a significant result that we are seeing when we move from fossil fuels to electric technologies. So basically, in our view, as e-mobility Europe, we see social leasing as a policy that stands at the intersection of climate policy and industrial policy, while at the same time, it supports social equity. And this is very valuable. I've been in this space for over 10 years now, and every time we talk climate policy, we talk distributional effects. And we always had this component, the low income and medium income households that were left there exposed to higher capex, because you also mentioned about clean tech and acceleration. Of course, electric vehicles are new models, are new cars. They have the innovation premium that's integrated often to their costs. Initially, they were targeting the high income segments of the population because they were able to pay for this premium. But what I think social leasing is doing is actually acting like a disruptor in the way people use vehicles and in the way the market is shaping. Instead of focusing on the high-income vehicles and high-price vehicles and high-income groups, it targets the people that really need support for this capex. And it also pushes manufacturers and OEMs to rethink the way they produce their vehicles, to bring new models to the market that are more affordable. And this is essential. And if I'm not mistaken, by the end of the year, we will have almost 20 new models or 20 EV models that are below 20,000 euros. So this is important because also internal combustion engines, their prices is not dropping either. It's like we have in most European countries support schemes for consumers to buy an internal combustion engine vehicle. So the reality is there. People across the income structures, they struggle to purchase a new vehicle. So we believe that that social leasing is something that will support the market, that will also drive new models, bring more industry into Europe. So when you tie it with the Made in Europe strategy, we are now looking at the new French scheme that also introduces different levels of support when the vehicles are made in Europe or with a battery that is made in Europe. So I think it's very important to use this instrument in a way that basically creates this social cohesion and brings a full ecosystem on board. Maybe just 3 thoughts that I would like to leave you with. I think it's very important for the system to work. It's important to have policy stability. So here, social leasing also contributes as something, at an investment signal. No, it gives OEMs the visibility that there will be demand for those vehicles. So we need to keep that going. We also we need to think about the wider policy mix. So what happens with the CO2 standards? We need to look at other complementary measures. For instance, the fleets proposal, the clean vehicle proposal that is complementary to it and addresses another population segment, I would say. And maybe a very important point that was brought up by several speakers, I think we need to think beyond the vehicle when we design social leasing schemes, and that's also to take into consideration charging. And where customers are charging, that's something that's very important. Maybe if there can be some support for removing the VAT on electricity or removing some taxes that shouldn't be on the electricity bill, that's also something that could help to reduce the prices paid by consumer at charging. And last but not least, I would say we need to balance incentives and disincentives. So yes, I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the timing and yes, really interesting. I think we can stay in this mood and this kind of reflection with the next speaker from Transport and Environment. And you have been raising awareness on social leasing for quite some time now. Are you fully aware of the benefits and potential risks it could have? So maybe you can also help us to ask some questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on this very important topic. There's been a lot of great interventions this morning. I will try to add our views. Indeed, as TNE, we've been working on social leasing for several years. So thank you and congratulations to the S&D Group for being so active in coming with a strong proposal on this very important topic. So I want to share two numbers to start with. The first number is 30 million. That's the number of Europeans living in a state of transport vulnerability, which in our study we define as being a combination of being car dependent and having low or medium income. These people are often driving old petrol cars and are trapped in a fossil fuel dependency because they cannot afford to switch to a new electric car. The second number is 25%. Only 25% of the new electric cars are small. This compares with 40% for the overall market, which is small. And even in some countries like Spain and Italy, more than 50%. So there is a dramatic mismatch between the supply and demand. EVs are too big, too expensive to fit the average consumer's needs. So bringing affordable, small electric cars to vulnerable groups is indeed at the core of what we need to do and social leasing. I was quite hopeful when the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced a small affordable car initiative in her State of the Union speech last year. But so far, that proposal has largely come empty-handed. But the Commission can now correct this. Now, more than ever, it is time to act. There is urgency, and there's two reasons for this. The first one is obviously the energy crisis. We are living through what the IEA has called the mother of all energy crises. But the big difference with previous crises is that today the technology is ready. Car makers have introduced a dozen of affordable models which are below 25,000 euros. We know that EV drivers are 5 times less impacted by the increase in energy prices in times of energy crisis compared to those driving petrol cars. So the most impacted by this increase are the low and medium income car-dependent households. But EVs are truly a true protection shield against these volatile oil prices, and vulnerable drivers need this shield the most. The second reason why we urgently need to act is that the EV market is now booming. New affordable electric car models are leading a surge in electric car sales. This was true from last year with the CO2 targets coming into force, but this will be reinforced by the energy crisis. Last month, in March, we have seen an increase in electric car sales by 50% compared to the previous year. And this is because buyers are looking for a way to escape the petrol pump. So now is the ideal moment to accelerate and build on that momentum. However, what we see is that the car industry lobby, as well as some governments like the German government, the Italian government, are trying to push to weaken the CO2 rules that are currently being discussed as part of this automotive package. So there is a massive disconnect between the interests of European sovereignty, European economic security, European drivers, and the attempt to weaken the CO2 targets by some stakeholders. So if we follow their lead, EV sales would flatline, and projects for affordable EVs would be delayed, scaled back, or even cancelled, because when ambition is reduced, these are the models which are impacted first because they have lower margins compared to others. Okay, I will maybe slow down a little bit for my final part. So it was just to say that we cannot scale social leasing without ambitious car CO2 rules. So just to finish now on our proposal, we have been developing a proposal for what we have called an affordable electric car platform to bring social leasing to scale, which is quite similar to what the S&D Group has proposed today. This platform will indeed pool demand. It would act as a broker or aggregator, bundling national demand to secure high volumes of made-in-Europe bids from car makers and leasing companies. Many member states are very keen on social leasing, but they lack the administrative, let's say, capacity of a state and a country like France. So the EU really has a role here to streamline and facilitate and do some matchmaking between the offer and the supply. If done right, this allows to cover around 15% of the 30 million vulnerable drivers that I have mentioned already in 2032. That's 5 million schemes across the EU, and this ensures that this group of vulnerable drivers don't lag behind the rest of the population. I think this is very important as well. It will cost about 30 billion euros, which could be financed by a combination of ETS2 revenue, social climate fund, of course, but also a windfall profit tax on the fossil fuel industry. Just a piece of comparison, already now, since the beginning of the Iran war, there's been no less than 37 billion euros of oil, of profits generated by the oil industry in Europe. So to finish with, crucially, this is also, this policy would be a game changer for the European industry. This plan gives the European car industry the demand certainty it needs to produce millions of mass-produced, affordable, compact electric cars. It would mark a strong turn away from the current strategy of pushing high-margin SUVs and a return to compact cars that underpin European industrial strength. So by championing European social leasing, the Commission has a chance to finally deliver on its promise for an affordable electric car initiative and provide a tangible shield to protect millions of vulnerable Europeans while boosting the industrial production of the European automotive industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I had only a few words in Italian. So, grazie a tutti.
Thank you everyone for this really very interesting discussion. We'll leave it up to Mohammed to draw the conclusions because this is really his event. I'd just like to add one thing. As socialists and democrats, I think it's absolutely vital for us to ensure that we have all the necessary tools we need to ensure that the unacceptable gap that exists in the automobile industry too, whereby we have some people who are paying for example, a very high rent, to use a different example, but can't afford to buy a house. Or alternatively, people who just about manage to pay their electricity bills but can't afford the infrastructure for clean electricity. There again, similarly, people pay a fortune to buy their own car because they can't use public transport. And they're caught in a trap where they can't afford to pay less. So this is the trap that we're trying to provide them with an escape from, and we think social leasing can be a solution. Thank you very much, everyone.
So thank you very much for this morning and for this engaging discussion and for having shared all your perspective. We touched upon so many topics. I will now ask, please, to S&D Vice President Mohammed Chahim to join us to the stage for his concluding remark, and thank him once again for having put forward such a strong proposal, so important for our triple transition, green, technological, and social. Mohammed.
Thank you, Georgia. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Annalisa. Thank you, all speakers to this panel. I mean, I don't have much to add. As I said, this is a topic that we will continue working on. I know that tomorrow probably the Commission will come with some communications around this topic. Let's see how concrete it is and how I think it could create some incentives also for member states to develop this topic a bit further. As I said, I've heard a lot of critique. We didn't only invite the people that agree with us, because at the end of the day, you need to make sure that plans are implementable, and for that you need to be confronted with the weaknesses. It will also not be a solution that will benefit everyone. That's also never has been like our incentive. We try to accommodate and we try to create an instrument that at least takes away some of the burdens existing in society and at the same time creates opportunities for businesses. So we will continue having the conversation, and as I said, please continue having discussions with people like Giorgio, with Thomas, with me, and Annalisa. The more concrete we can make the plans, the more we can guide and maybe push towards the Commission to come up with a social leasing plan for Europe. For now, I just want to say we have lunch prepared. Let's continue the conversation, but a little bit more informally. Thank you all, and see you next time.